Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and tonight I'd like to continue this study through the lessons in the book Understanding Classical Catholic Education. I hope that you enjoyed the first discussion as we worked through the first part of the introduction. In this video, we'll move through the second part, which talks about the power of reason. And before I get started, let me just say that as you think about classical Catholic education, one of the most important things that you need to focus on as you learn about classical Catholic education is the relationship that exists between reason and divine revelation. Reason is what is the faculty that we possess, the faculty that makes us the unique creatures in the world that we are. But what's important about reason is that it's the natural means by which we seek to know God and all sorts of sublime truths. God gave us the faculty of reason that we might seek him. But the faculty of reason, as Thomas Aquinas points out in the very first question of the Summa Theologica, can only lead us so far. Reason can only lead us so far. There are truths about God which are necessary for salvation, which we simply cannot discover by the power of reason alone. That's one of the problems with reason. Another problem with reason is that wise men who devote themselves to the pursuit of wisdom will succeed in learning a great deal about God and about God's creatures by the power of reason, but it will only be a few men in the entire human race who gain that wisdom. And there are many different circumstances and factors that limit to what degree men can seek wisdom by the aid of reason alone. So very few people will know the truth. And thirdly, even when men do study and devote themselves to the truth by the use of their faculty of reason, there's all kinds of junk and errors mixed in with the truth. A good example of this can be seen in the writings of someone like Plato. As much as Plato helps us and discovers at his point in human history, there's all kinds of error mixed in. And so there's always this mixture of falsehood within all of the truth that philosophy makes available to us. And so these three weaknesses of reason, that there are necessary truths that it simply cannot discover, that it will really only be useful for a small number of people who have the leisure and motivation to use it. And thirdly, even those who do are going to have their knowledge of God and of the world mixed with error. And so while reason is very useful and very powerful, it's not sufficient to bring us to the knowledge of God, or it's not sufficient to bring as many people to the knowledge of God as God wants to come to the knowledge of himself. And so we're going to see in the history of philosophy, the history of truth-seeking, of wisdom-seeking, that reason can only get us so far. And then we're dependent upon the light that God reveals by divine revelation, and the science of what can be known of God through divine revelation is called theology. So classical Catholic education, as we're going to see as we continue through this introduction, has a lot to do with the relationship between philosophy, which is knowledge that can be attained by means of reasoning, and theology, which is knowledge that is made known to us by the grace of God through revelation. So these two sources, human effort through the use of reason and God's mercy through his own self-revelation, these come together to lead us to a knowledge of true wisdom that is capable of leading us to eternal life. And bringing those two things together and building a program of study where philosophy and theology come together, that's what classical Catholic education is. In the pre-Christian world, you had philosophy without theology, and it was imperfect. Even though Aristotle brought it as close as it could possibly come to the truth, it was still imperfect. And then when Christ came into the world, we had the perfection of divine revelation, and we had the establishment of the church with the full light of divine revelation, once for all given to the world through Christ and the traditions of the apostles, and then preserved for all time and expounded by the Catholic Church, but given once for all. And in the Catholic Church, we have the coming together of divine revelation and human philosophy to give us the beauty of Catholic learning. Before the Catholic Church, there was imperfect philosophy, but many have gone to an opposite extreme, especially in modern times, in modern Christian circles, where there is an attempt to know theology and live the Christian life without philosophy. And that leads to all kinds of problems, which we see in modern Catholic culture. We can't have Catholicism without classical philosophy. The two come together, and when they're together in full strength, that's when Catholic culture really thrives. And God helping us, we're working to restore those two sources in Catholic education. That's what classical Catholic education is. And it's not present in modern schools or even in modern Catholic circles. So the restoration of classical Catholic education has more to do with the restoration of classical philosophy, because Catholic theology is what it is. The Church preserves that for us. We can find it in the scriptures and the catechisms. We have true theology, but true philosophy has largely been lost through the distraction of the scientific revolution, through all kinds of modern false teachings and false philosophical movements. We've lost the knowledge of classical philosophy, and we've got to work to restore that. And our patron and model in that work is St. Thomas Aquinas, who is for us the model of the classical Catholic wise man that we're seeking to become through classical Catholic education. So in this video, we're going to walk through this section of the introduction, which talks about the power of reason, and then in the next video, we'll talk about the next section, which talks about the necessity of divine revelation. So let's read this section on the power of reason together, and we'll talk about it a bit as we go through. Let's take a look at the text. The power of reason. When we look back at the ancient world, we obviously can find wise men. In Israel, we know of Noah, Abraham, Job, Moses, Samuel, Solomon, David, Isaiah, and many more. Outside of Israel, we find wise men, most of whom have unfortunately been made to appear ridiculous through the exaggeration of the poets. The question we must ask is, how did these men obtain their wisdom? How did these ancient wise men become wise? How did they obtain their wisdom? What form of education did they receive? Was there a system of education in the ancient world? How did Abraham become wise? How did Solomon or David or Isaiah the prophet or Socrates or Pythagoras or the ancient Egyptian philosophers, how did they become wise men? How did they obtain their wisdom? What form of education did they receive? With none of the technology or tools available to us, they obtained wisdom and understanding of the world that is hard for us to fathom, who learn so little despite having so much. How did they obtain the wisdom that they had? That's a question that we should be asking. Moving on to the next paragraph, man is referred to scientifically as Homo sapiens, or reasoning man. This notion of man's rational nature may be understood when we consider the four operations of the human mind: perception, predication, reasoning, and arrangement. These are the four operations of the mind: perception, predication, reasoning, and arrangement. These direct us in understanding the means to true education. When we understand how the human mind works, we can understand how education needs to work and can work to lead men to wisdom. So let's look at these four operations. First of all, we have perception. Perception is the operation of the mind whereby mental images are collected through the senses. Perception is the operation of the mind whereby mental images are collected through the senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. The mind operates like a camera, storing images of what is perceived. For this reason, you can close your eyes and you can still, quote unquote, see a friend, smell a rose, or feel a warm fire. These mental images are called ideas, and they are the first action or the products of the first action or operation of the human mind. So the first operation of the human mind is perception, the operation whereby we perceive objects that are more or less outside of us, and we form mental images or notions or ideas of these things. That's the first of the four operations of the mind. The second operation is predication. Predication. And you may recognize that word because in grammar we learn about subjects and predicates. A predicate is what is said about a subject. That has to do with this act or operation of predication. Predication is the operation of the mind whereby images are compared. Images that exist in the mind are compared. They are either joined together or they are disjoined. We call this a predication or a judgment. So this second operation of the mind could also be called judgment. When we compare ideas in our minds and we either join them together or we disjoin or separate them. This is called predication or judgment. For example, our mind has an idea of ice and an idea of coldness and joins them together by predication. And the predication or judgment that our mind forms is ice is cold, or universally all ice is cold. These ideas of ice and coldness are joined together. All ice is cold. The verb is, which is called a copula, joins together these two ideas. All ice is cold. This is predication. On the contrary, Our mind disjoins the idea of ice from the idea of hotness, disjoins them, and predicates no ice is hot. No ice is hot. Here we are denying the link and are saying ice and hotness, or hot, do not agree. That's predication or judgment, the second operation of the mind. Next, the mind continues from predication, sorry, there's a typo there. The mind continues from predication to reasoning by comparing one predication or judgment with another. So just as in predication we compare simple ideas, in reasoning we compare the judgments themselves. We compare predications. The mind continues comparing one predication with another, leading to new and more complex judgments by means of what is called a syllogism. For example, the mind, reflecting upon the fact that all ice is cold and that the sun is hot, produces a new judgment. The sun is not ice. This is an example of reasoning. And we can get into that in much more detail, but this is a simple overview of the operations of the mind. If you really want to get into this, you need to study classical reasoning. Lastly, the mind arranges these arguments to form systems through which future perceptions, predications, and reasonings are categorized for yet further reasonings. And we call this arrangement. Now, when we imagine this powerful, active human mind set loose in the world as it was at creation, it does not require much time for man to make great progress in learning in the world. And that's what I want us to focus on, is how the powers and the operations that were created in our minds by God immediately start working as soon as man begins to live in the world. These operations begin. It doesn't take much time for that powerful mind to make great progress in learning. More importantly, inasmuch as the world was designed by the wisdom of God, it was also a perfect teacher of man. The creation silently speaks to man's reason. Man's ability to reason can safely lead him to the mastery of creation's resources and ultimately to the knowledge and love of the Creator. Reason is intended to draw men, to lead men to God in and through the created world. Remember, the created world was created by God. The reason, the mind that we were given, was designed to operate in this world which was itself created by God. We're not living in some world, some godless world. We're living in a world that God created for us to lead us to our ultimate end. And our mind is the tool that was created for us by God to lead us in and through this world to Him, to be happy with Him forever. And then in the last paragraph we read, it was by this quote-unquote eye of the soul It was by this eye of the soul that ancient men made such great progress, and this was God's intention for them. If left to themselves, with this guide alone, man had the capacity of enjoying a life full of happiness and wisdom. Eden could have remained a paradise forever, and the world would have known only truth. That's the end of that second section of this introduction. Now, I know as you listen to that, you may be thinking of objections. What do you mean Eden could have remained a paradise and all this? You have to realize we're getting there. The next section is titled The Necessity of Revelation, so calm down, okay? We're talking theoretically here. Man in the created world, created by God in all of its perfect goodness, and man placed in that world with this powerful mind could have enjoyed the knowledge of God forever, theoretically speaking. So don't think that I'm suggesting that man could have lived forever, but no, we're getting to that. But what I want to focus on here is that the world, the created world, is good. The natural world, as God created it, is good. And man, as God created him, is good. The mind of man is good. We have to be very careful to avoid the traps of what's called dualism, which has just been at the heart of heresy from the beginning of the church and a cause of endless confusion and error in human philosophy. There is no battle between good and evil. There is no good spirit and bad spirit, good world and bad world, heaven versus hell. There's no battle between opposing forces in this world. The world belongs to God. It's God's creation. Everything is under his control. And there are bad influences, but the bad influences are considered like a drop in the bucket. They're not powerful. They're not significant. The only reason evil influences are significant is because we, by our free will, allow them to become significant. And so we have to be careful that we don't look at the world with the error that's called dualism, as if there's these two equal powers battling it out, like a superhero movie, and oh, the superhero's down, oh, he's back, oh, he's down. No, there's no such battle taking place. There's no dualistic strife in the world. There's God and everything that's permanent and eternal and beautiful and good. And then there are bad influences, God's creatures, that have been corrupted by their own abuse of freedom. And they are all destined for judgment. So there's no great struggle or strife. And what I want you to think about when we talk about education and philosophy, we have to make sure that we don't have some kind of frightened, timid, dualistic view of the world, where we're hiding and running away from the world. The world is good. The natural world is true and leads us to God. I always think to myself, if you read a book, it's got error mixed into it because it's human writing. If you listen to a song, it's got error mixed into it because it's human production. If you watch a movie, it's got error mixed into it. It's got sin mixed into it because it's a human product. But if you go outside in the middle of the night and stare up at the night sky, it's true. It's God's creation. God directly made what you see. If you go and stand at the beach and look over the ocean, everything that you see is true and good. And your senses just absorb all of this truth in the created world. The world is good. Man, in his creation, is good. Our neighbors in their humanity are good. But the problem is that we corrupt ourselves by abusing freedom that God gave to us, and we allow all kinds of evil influences to take control of our body, to take control of our mind, to take control of our senses, control of our mouths, and so on. And we give them an appearance of power. And when we come to philosophy, we have to have an optimistic view of human nature. We have to have an optimistic view of the world. And we have to see that the world is not composed of Christians who are good and everyone else who is evil. The world has been composed of good men, Christian and non-Christian, who have been, as much as they're capable of, seeking the truth by means of the tools that God gave them. And when we look back in the ancient world, we find extremely wise men. And these are men, one thing I always like to focus on when I hear Christians criticizing ancient philosophers or ancient poets or even criticizing other Christians. Any time that we're going to criticize someone, we have to ask ourselves, what could they have been doing? What could they have been doing? If you take Socrates or Plato or Aristotle or even, philosophers that we now know taught false philosophy, we have to consider what they were doing and what they did relative to what they could have been doing. They could have been just totally immoral men given entirely over to the pursuit of sinful carnal pleasures, but they weren't. Even the men who didn't get philosophy right were seeking noble things in a time when there isn't much motivation to seek noble things. And that's why they're called the virtuous pagans. The virtuous pagans. Pagans who were living in the midst of totally corrupt societies filled with all kinds of immorality. And yet there they were talking about questions of virtue and vice and what a good life consisted of and how to be happy. And even if their teaching and their understanding wasn't right, we have to realize those men were doing good things when they could have been doing very bad things. And we have to learn to look positively at these men, considering not whether or not what they did was perfect, but whether or not what they were doing was praiseworthy relative to what they could have been doing, to what they were free to do but chose not to. That's how we can see and appreciate the goodness of ancient men. And when we look back at Egyptian society or Babylonian society or Greek or Roman society, we can point out immorality, we can point out idolatry. But if we look at it with a different perspective, if we look at it and compare it to what they could have been in terms of their capacity for evil, and we consider what they chose to be instead of that, we can see that they're quite respectable. And like I said, that's why in Christian tradition, those ancient philosophers and poets are often referred to as the virtuous pagans, pagans who chose to seek virtue in a period of human history when there wasn't much motivation to seek virtue except virtue itself. When we put human beings in this created world with the environment of ancient society, which was much more primitive than modern society, there was much less human population. Obviously, none of the distractions of technology we have. Human beings were much more in direct contact with the natural world. Their senses, their minds were receiving input from a world that was good and true. and the operation of their mind with fewer distractions, with more access to the created world of nature itself, gave them a, an intellectual culture that we may have less of today because of all the distractions that we've created. And so we see these men in the ancient world gaining an amazing amount of wisdom and knowledge, doing virtuous things, not relative to Christianity, obviously. I mean, we can't expect that people who lived before Pentecost will in any way be comparable to people who live after Pentecost. It's two completely different worlds. Pentecost changes everything. Human beings have access to divine grace, divine power, divine wisdom, and so on. That comes with Pentecost. These men who lived before Pentecost, when we consider relatively the achievements that they made and the good things that they enjoyed and pursued, it's really amazing. And if we learn to think rightly about it, we have a more positive view of it. And I believe, I would argue that this is how the Catholic Church teaches us to think about non-Catholic people. Many people are not Catholics, not because they've learned the truth of the Catholic faith and have rejected it, but because they haven't learned the Catholic faith. And the good that they have is a sincere effort and pursuit of what's good by means of the natural tools that God has created in us. And in that, they're praiseworthy, because we always have to consider what they are relative to what they could be. And often we find that they're much better by choice than they could be. I know I was like that as a teenage kid. I had access to all kinds of evils, and I really can't explain why I didn't do more bad things. I had friends who drank and smoked and used drugs and were immoral and all kinds of... I was just a pagan kid myself, but for some reason, I didn't want to do a lot of those things. And so you could compare me as an 18-year-old to some kid raised in a Catholic family, and I looked like garbage compared to that kid. But relative to what I could have been, I was a good kid. It's a matter of perspective, whether we judge someone relative to a grace-filled person, which really isn't a fair comparison, or whether we judge a person relative to what they could have been. That's how we really can see, I think, the virtue of an individual person. Not whether a person is like Jesus as an unbeliever, or whether a person is like a saint as an unbeliever, but whether an unbeliever is like, whether an unbeliever is as evil as he could be. And when we see that he's not, it's a sign that there's some seed of goodness in that person that's keeping him from being as bad as he could be. And we should be able to look at our neighbors and see that goodness in them, restraining the evil that they could be practicing, but aren't for many different reasons. So the achievements and the culture of the ancient world, yeah, when compared to Christianity, if we compare every single person, every ancient philosopher to Thomas Aquinas, it's ridiculous. But we shouldn't do that. It's not right to compare a pre-Christian Greek philosopher to Thomas Aquinas. That's not a fair comparison. We have to look at the achievements of the ancients and compare them, compare the pursuits of their lives, compare the interests, the effort that they made with what was available to them in terms of sin, in terms of pleasure, and see that they chose not to have it. Like the philosopher Diogenes, who protested against the luxury of the Athenian people and lived in a clay pot in the Athenian marketplace. I think it was Athens. For For some reason, I'm questioning that. But what motivated a man to do that centuries before Christ? What motivated Socrates to be willing to die centuries before Christ? What motivated Plato to devote his life to the pursuit of wisdom? What motivated Aristotle to do the incomprehensible work that he did to produce the organon and establish the philosophical sciences? These things are hard to explain. These men didn't have the Holy Spirit. They weren't living a sacramental life in the church. They didn't have the light of divine revelation, and yet they did such amazingly good things. It's hard for us to understand what drove them to do those good works, and their achievements are incredible. The achievements of ancient Egyptian mathematics and astronomy are incredible. The achievement of ancient Babylonian mathematics and astronomy are incredible. They didn't have to pursue those things. They could have just been seeking to find the most delicious food or, physical pleasures of sex and things like that. They didn't. They chose to live as priests and as philosophers and wise men. That's strange. That's human. Something human about that. That was at work in those ancient people. And all of this is owed to the power of reason, which is the source of human philosophy. It's this gift of reason that God created in us that separated wise men from the common people, as Aristotle explains in his Ethics. And when you take that mind, created to seek and know the truth, created for truth, which is our end, and you let that mind loose in the world, if it can carry out its operations for any length of time without distraction or getting knocked off the rails by some error or deception, it doesn't take long for that mind to accomplish amazing things, even in our own lives. When I look at my life, and I consider myself to be pretty smart, but when I look back at my life, all of the knowledge that I obtained came in a relatively short period of time. When I got things lined up in my life, when my life was on track and focused, it didn't take me long to make achievements in learning. And the same is true of anyone, of any students. It doesn't take long to make great achievements. Once we get our minds focused, we free ourselves from entanglements and distractions and just let our minds do what they were designed to do. They want to study, they want to learn, they want to seek the truth. Our minds want to learn and be wise. We prevent them from doing that by our sins, by our own vices and lack of discipline. We create the obstacles that prevent us from enjoying the good things God designed us to enjoy. And so it's important for us as we get started to understand the four operations of the mind and realize God made us to do that. That's our nature, to perceive, to predicate, to reason, and to arrange reasonings. God designed us to do that. We do that naturally. Just like when a baby's born and it's never existed outside the womb, and yet you see that it's designed to begin sucking and looking for a source of food. It's designed to suck. The human mind, in the same way, is designed to seek. It's designed to search and to investigate this world, seeking some satisfaction that it can't explain but knows is out there somewhere. And that's the beauty, the mystery of human nature. And when we see times in human history where an individual man was living a life where that mind was allowed to run a little bit, the achievements just begin to multiply and explode. And we can find points in human history, places in human history where that happened, and the achievements are incredible. All of that's owed to the power of reason. So it would seem that this power of reason was sufficient for man. It was all man needed. Those who don't study have no excuse, and those who want to be saved and want to be happy simply need to exercise that gift of reason and seek God. But, as we'll see in the next part of this introduction, it's not so simple, because there are other influences in the world that can easily derail us in this pursuit. And so, while all of that potential is there, there's all of that potential good in human nature and in human society, in human learning. What we find is that that good is corrupted by all sorts of influences that distract it and hinder it from pursuing its own nature. And they lead us into all kinds of errors and troubles and miseries and evils. And we'll learn in the next section why divine revelation was necessary. If we're given this power of reasoning, why would we need divine revelation? We'll look at that in the next section. So I hope that's helpful just to understand what the four operations of the mind are, so you can become conscious of them and understand how your own mind works. One of the strange things about the mind is that the mind is, or reason, is one of the only operations, one of the only things in the world that can investigate itself. And so we can think about our own thinking. We can meditate on our own meditation, reason about our own reasoning. That's what separates us from all other creatures, the ability to examine ourselves, to know ourselves, which leads us to the knowledge of our Creator. So I hope that's a helpful little study there of this section on the power of reason. And the reason I looked at that at this point in the introduction was to get after this question, which I want us to ask. How did the ancients know so much? How did they have such great wisdom? Go read the Proverbs of Solomon. He lived 1,000 years before Christ, 600 years before Socrates or Plato or Aristotle. How did Solomon have such great wisdom? How did Moses have such great wisdom to write the law and to give ancient Israel, what was it, 1,200 years or more before Christ? I don't have the date in my head right now. But where did that wisdom come from? And I think you'll be surprised, because the simple Sunday school answer is, well, God gave him wisdom. But when we read the book of Acts, we find St. Stephen talking about how Moses grew up with the education, with the learning of the Egyptians. What was that learning? What was that ancient education that Moses had as an Egyptian? These are questions that we need to investigate. These are answers that we need to figure out in order for us to understand what we should be studying, what we should be learning, how education should be pursued by us today. We want to know, how did the ancients learn what they learned? And as we dig into it in the course of this book through these lessons, we're going to look at how the ancients learned, what education consisted of in the ancient world, and how it continued to develop into the Christian era, and what it means for us to enjoy a classical Catholic education. So I hope that's a helpful little introduction to the power of reason, and it sets the stage for our next discussion in this book, which is the necessity of revelation. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about this section, anything you'd like to get into in a little more detail, just let me know in the comments or by email, and I'll follow up with you. I hope that's helpful. God bless.